This is Synopsis, a series of conversations run in the framework of Abeceda Institute. I'm Neža Zupanc, and with me today is Jack Herscowitz. Welcome, and please a couple of words of introduction.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me, Neža. It's always nice to talk. So my name is Jack Herscowitz. I am a composer, improviser, and sound artist based in Los Angeles. My work is generally very broad, but usually it deals with questions of intention, not intention, attention, relationships, as well as the relationship between performance and the body. Um, so thank you for having me.
Thank you for taking your time. Can we start here, perhaps? Why or how did you come in your compositional practice to what you just mentioned, to attention? And let's start there, since if it's at the center of your practice, it might be relevant for everyone to hear it immediately. Hear more about that.
Yeah, of course. It's I mean it's been a very long, it's always a long journey. I feel that when I started creating original music for the first time, as I feel like a lot of people do, it's very intuitive. Um, it's you do what needs to be done at the moment, and then later on, do you sort of realize exactly what you're doing. But I think the way my music used to be is it was actually very um, it was always very breakneck. I think about John Zorn a lot as like this sort of fake, this like premonition of TikTok, uh, in
Premonition.
like a predicted TikTok
Oh,
almost. It's like listening to his music, he could have
so
never
the quick
foreseen
shifts and
these
switches.
these quick shifts and switches. And yeah, exactly. And I wrote actually a lot of music that was really inspired by that. And I think there's this experience of growing up in the internet, that I think kind of you know solidifies that way of thinking and approaching music. Everything moves at this breakneck speed. Everything is accessible on this singular surface. It's so clear that these two things are related. And I started realizing, I think about like 2 3 years ago, that my music had like really slowed down, and I felt um, completely unable to and completely uninterested in returning to this thing. And it wasn't until I was forced to work on doctorate applications this fall that I actually really felt like I actually understood why. And it was this question of attention, this question of slowing down, um, and not even necessarily slowing down, because slow music can also take your attention so many different places, be episodic, narrative in that way, but really focusing on singular actions, both the audience and the performers. I care quite a lot about that. I'm thinking about both. I'm thinking about, the experience of the music in time as an audience member, but also the experience of doing maybe a singular action as a performer as well. And I think
Their
there's
action, by that you mean, for example, only playing one frequency on the instrument for a long time.
yes, exactly what you did in my ensemble piece.
Yes. Exactly.
Exactly that. And that's why I picked that as my
Right,
intro music,
right, right.
because it was good to
We
have
are
you.
referring to the composition titled I Peered Inside a Black Hole and Saw Us. Yes,
Yes.
for any listeners that want to. No.
Yes. So I think in terms of attention, that's how I got there. Um, is I think it really became this natural thing of introspection and also sort of contextualizing my work in relation to sort of this digital reality that we're dealing with um, quite often. But also it, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, it was also just a natural shift, um, and one that I don't know. I don't know how my work is going to, continue to develop, but I imagine that this will remain a pretty essential element of what it is that I'm interested in doing because it feels very necessary, and it's hard to not do it actually these days.
So, and that's probably something we should, also continue with.
Yeah.
But before we continue, if I understand correct, so the singular action, this is something that distinguishes your current stage. And if I understood you correct, you began at the opposite end. With as well, you said you were inspired. You also did this quick shift in your earlier compositions, if I
Yeah, I
understood.
mean, my earlier music oftentimes was this very episodic,
Yeah.
changing the channel type thing.
Hmm.
It was something that was really, really important
It's
to me.
curious. It's curious also in where I began composing. It
Hmm.
was also like that. Sometimes I and perhaps it's all connected, but uh, what I consider one of the reasons is also to hold the thought of music that you're composing
Hmm.
is, and it's perhaps just a part of what you're speaking of, to
Hmm.
hold the thought for long enough to actually write it down in entirety
Hmm.
uh, was is still a challenge in composition for me. And at that time, it was also very short sections of something, and then immediate shift to something else.
Yeah, it totally relates to the compositional process. I've never thought of it that way as well. It's like, yeah, it forces you, I guess, to sit in something for a longer period of
Yeah,
time rather than just having these blips of things and having to immediately write them down.
yeah,
At least
and
that's
it
how I, yeah.
and you cannot just really immediately have it written when
Hmm.
you're first time writing it down. At least I was not in that position to do it.
Yeah, yeah,
So
totally.
that's curious. So we left it at you think saying that you think this is necessary. Why? Why?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can only speak, I always speak for my own experience. Is that my attention is too fried, to like put it very bluntly. Um, and I'm I find it, also that these days very often it's not totally true. I mean, it would be unfortunate if it was totally true because then there's no mystery in other things and even no mystery in it. Um, but I find that I often have the most visceral, emotional experiences and intense experiences listening to music that is of this similar nature that deals with attention because it actually to me if it causes this very conscious engagement from an audience perspective, at least to me, and that sometimes what's really beautiful is I really have to fight, this music. I think a lot about like, you know, when you think about like Wandelweiser music as like, this thing that moves between, uses silence as this moment to move between the music and the world. Um, I think when I first encountered that, I had this idea that it was, oh, this like kind of sweet, loving, thing. But I've actually come to realize that it's both for the performers and the audience, it's like really intense and it's really difficult. It's really difficult to play and it's really difficult to listen to. And that's actually really exciting when you have to deal with these with you have to deal with boredom as an audience member, when you have to deal with this movement back and forth between like the sound in the world, when you have to deal with a single idea so in depth that you really have to dive into it. um, those are all like very exciting, engaging things to me. That's to engage with all of that is to very engage deeply with the music, and that's all I can ever want. And I think to believe in a music that has transformative power, it, it is to believe that an engaging experience in music can be transformative, and to believe that it's necessary to have an engaging experience. So I care about that, and I want to make music that does that. And to me, this is the a not the way, but this is a very necessary and personally relevant way of doing it. Um, I like I can write music that sort of does this thing that it was doing 5 years ago for me, the channel flipping thing. And I have actually a little bit here and there, but the more and more I just like can't finish the piece and I throw it in the garbage, um, because it just like there's just like something kind of like doesn't feel right. um, does that I feel like that hopefully covers the bases.
You are the expert on that. So, but yeah,
Yeah,
it provides an entry into the compositional practice.
yeah.
Is there is there on the macro something, uh, a trajectory that you want to this a trajectory you want to continue on?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I actually have a lot of trajectories. This is definitely a part of it. Um, but in terms of like this type of music, I I'm interested in more with this question of duration, um, both in like the very obvious sense of writing longer works, because I've never written a piece over 30 minutes. And that is something that's very exciting to me and interesting. But also, on that frame of thinking about duration as a subjective experience, right? um, 10 minutes can feel longer than 45 minutes sometimes, right? The experience of time is something that is, really not related to the clock. And the clock, is also, there's different types of clocks. Um, you know, there's, we're dealing with, a very regimented, um, you know, uh, sort of division of time.
Mm-hmm.
We're still dealing with like an idea of linear progress and all these types of things. Um, but what are other ways of experiencing time, right? So not just write a longer piece, but how do I make the first 10 minutes feel different than the next 10 minutes? That's something I don't really have any idea how to do yet. It's kind of just a thought so far. Maybe I need to think more about, it's just, I guess, I mean, I don't guess. It is like a psychoacoustic question, which is something I know very little about. So that's the sort of direction that I imagine this work going in. But I'm also curious, going back to the previous things that I was talking about, um, in terms of like engagement, with this like singular idea or something that's so slow moving or etc. I'm curious what like that experience is like from. I talked about Wandelweiser being difficult for both the audience and the performers. If you have any thoughts on that, as both obviously a composer, music listener, but also as a performer yourself.
On the engagement, could you one part of the phrase I didn't understand?
Yeah, this question of engaging in a singular action as this like transformative experience, or something that causes you to engage in the music in a different
Yes,
way.
I mean something that
Yeah.
you also mention is that when, and I will just speak on the example of the already mentioned composition. Something I noticed with that and with compositions that take similar methods of extending or yeah long duration of one action, in your words, of singular action, in a longer duration. uh, what's I, I seem to reliably experience with that is zooming into the what is happening, and what you also mentioned, actually discovering throughout that time the complexities, but it's we don't have to say complexities, or just um, the sound and new layers of the sound, um, due to simply the affordance of dwelling there and not having other things to do, to listen for. That is arguably so. Um, and yeah, that that is one of the things, especially um, with this. Also, 1 year earlier, uh, a very memorable experience with this, and 1 year earlier with PRS's composition for a string trio. Um, Simply, you keep on listening and hearing new things, even though uh, nothing is moving in terms of, let's say, pitch and dynamics, even though then you realize, yes, there are those little fluctuations of pitch and everything. And then when something does happen, and usually in these compositions it happens very, very slowly. um, it's it's a real uh, it has impact.
Yeah.
That's yeah.
Yeah. The second thing you just said about the impact, I mean, that reminds me a lot of the music of Elian Radik, um, of moving so glacially. And then you sort of realize 15
Glacially.
minutes.
That's a
Yeah.
great expression.
Yeah. And then
Not for
15
long,
minutes.
huh? You're coming
Oh,
back.
oh yeah. That's,
Sorry.
that is the true reality. Yeah. I guess
Dark
you need to,
humor. Yes.
well, no, you need to rethink about that word, right? Because now glaciers are moving quite quickly in that sense. That's actually really smart.
Sorry. Jump in,
No,
please.
it's good. It's good. It's really good. Um, you, yeah, you have like this, oh my God, this thing has been happening and I didn't even realize it moment. At least that's my experience with her music oftentimes. And what I love, it's also about, turning the knob, um, in this like, digital, or not digital, it's analog, electronic, performance world. But also the first thing that you were, talking about, of the still object, and your experience of it being dynamic, is really really increasingly important to me. um, and that if every object, right, is constantly in motion, it's constantly vibrating, your skin is constantly replacing itself, the sort of ship of Theseus type situation. um, uh, and and this like inherent dynamicism of all material is kind of, I guess, in a way, it's kind of a truth, and that and to bring attention to that, one, through the fact that nothing can truly be still, is exciting, but two, also to look at something that is ostensibly still but not really, and to have your experience of it change over time. um, that's like a form of engagement, both from the performers and the audience, that is like really, really deep, to me. And I find that, it's if you start looking at this thing that seems so obvious, right? And then you slowly over time realize that it's not obvious and that it reveals itself in some kind of interesting, kind of subjective way. I mean, that's really beautiful. The one person who I've become increasingly interested in who does this is there's this noise artist from France. His name is Vomir. And he puts a bag over his head whenever he performs. It's very, very iconic, um, sort of stage presence. But he sets up some sort of, system, situation, uh, and he leaves it there for the duration of his performance. And his records are just like that. There's just wall of sound, no changing. He has this kind of beautiful manifesto. I think it ends with like no development, no ideas, something like that. Um, but what's amazing is like listening to that music is like it's a really intense experience because it's not static. It's actually a very dynamic thing, and you experience this as this dynamic thing that changes over time. And I feel that that's I couldn't, in that way, the audience is actually almost composing with you. The listener is composing with you. And that's so exciting. But the question of also what material to pick, you know, is also an important one. And that's one that I don't really have an answer to. Um, because I think it does matter what materials you pick, actually. I'm not sure if it's just, you can have anything and just do this one thing for X amount of time and there you go,
Mhm,
that's the
mhm,
piece.
mhm.
I, I,
Yeah.
I, I do want to think that there's more to it, that the materials themselves actually do matter quite a great deal. Um, what it is, though, I don't have an answer to just yet.
Is this something that you take a look when you are, um, let's say, analyzing your practice? And is this a question that you work with? How does it look like when Jack Herscowitz sits down and is starting to compose? Is this like a part of that practice?
Is the like thinking about the materials, you mean?
Well, you just came to a question now
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
that doesn't have the answer.
Oh,
Also,
like this type of questioning.
yeah.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's compounding. The is that these questions compound over time. But I actually compose very intuitively.
Right.
Um, I still compose intuitively. And I think I compose intuitively because I think that keeps a little bit of the magic there, which I think is very important. I think if I lose too much of that magic, I talked about, again, I'm going back to this often, but I talked about at the beginning, it was always intuitive, and I was just doing what needed to be done
Mm.
to me, which is a personal experience shaped by the world, right? I still do that. I'm still very intuitive, but this intuition is now being shaped by these questions that have been marinating in my head for, a while. So they're going to obviously come out very different, right? And
Yeah.
I'm also in a very, different circumstance. I'm in a different place. I'm interacting with different musicians. I've done different things. I've interacted with different people in my life, right? So it remains intuitive to answer your question, but these questions that happen in between and throughout uh, will shape the work
Mm. Mm.
itself.
Yeah.
Um, So who knows? Yeah, none of my it's actually none of my pieces that I'm working on right now. Well, actually, yeah. I guess my ensemble piece for the ensemble this year actually does deal with this question of the material a
Mm,
little bit. um, so I guess it is. It already has manifested a little
mhm,
bit.
mm, mm. And that's the thing. I mean, from my experience, even if in any case those questions or considerations re-arise every time in one or another way.
Hmm.
Um, but another aspect of what we've been looking into was scale, because
Hmm.
then you, sorry, I'll just take it back a little bit. Um, uh, when we were speaking to duration and yeah, the amount of, let's say, changes that you notice, or the keyword on which scale your
Hmm.
attention is working.
Yeah.
Um, what I see here is that simply with this with this kind of a composition, that you set you as the composer set the scale to be so much. It's like a microscope when
Hmm.
you like this table in front of me looks just white, but when I put a microscope on it,
Hmm.
I will see all of these small things, and that's because yeah, you did that. So
Hmm.
it's you set that scale by the choice of materials, by duration, working with time.
Hmm.
By the way, because everyone mentions time in a sense, like as if, yes, I know there's been a lot of work dedicated to time, but
Hmm.
if I may, I think it's necessary for everyone to learn their own way through time as
Hmm.
composers,
Totally.
since music is without so many of concrete uh, physical aspects that other arts are
Yeah.
employ. Therefore, time is one. It's one of the cardinal physicalities of
Yeah. Yeah.
music,
I
right?
agree. Hmm.
So, of course, it's important. I mean, but yeah, actually, what I wanted to say was, how do you see then when you mentioned this is now more on the outlook of you as a composer?
Hmm.
How do you see when you mentioned that artist, the French Vomir,
Hmm.
when you mention him, just playing the same thing? So it's
Hmm.
and it's electronic, you said. So it's
Yeah.
literally s- s- uh, exactly the same. What where does it happen? Where is the scale set in that case, if you would say? So,
Yeah. Um, well, I guess in his case, I mean, he's setting time scales, which are you know, clock time scales,
mm,
which are really, you know, gargantuan. I've never seen him perform live, so I'm not totally sure what that looks like.
mm,
But his digital albums, and also I'll just like for anyone listening, it's like Vomir is like vomit, but instead of a T, there's an R. So that's
uh-huh.
that's that's the spelling. Um, is like it's like 6 hours. You know, a lot of these records, um, of just like this unchanging static thing. Um, so in that sense, I mean, he is really being, this absolute. I mean, it's very. He's taking his idea to, I guess, whatever extreme he really sees it going. I'm sure, limits are always moving, always dynamic. I don't want to say radical because my idea of what radical is always moving. Um, um, but you know, it's I'm growing. I'm also interested in like this question of how, I mentioned this before. Um, like how can you make 5 minutes feel like 6 hours? And not necessarily just relying on the clock time. Um, what else, it again with form, materials, or maybe something else that I'm not considering right now. Or even, what it is the musicians are, how they're engaging with the work, etc. Um, that you can achieve that without the consideration of clock time, right? And that's, his strategy is just, massive chunks of time, 6 hours.
Mhm.
Um, but how can you do that in other ways, without just relying on the clock, right? And I think there's also something beautiful about that because it's, again, we want to reclaim the subjective experience of time. Um, in it when our idea of how time moves is being, controlled in all of these ways. um, and so again, that's a question without an answer. You can check back in on me in 4 years. We'll see what I figured out.
Exactly. All right, so we have attention time.
Mhm.
Is there another of those trajectories that you are working upon?
Yeah, totally. um, I care actually a lot about uh, I would say, actually, I would say theater. Um, and I relate that to narrative, um, actually. And these are related things, but maybe they're also very different. And it's something I guess I haven't really like, talked shown a ton in like the context of my work with Abeceda. Oh, I did, I guess, with like the very first piece for like the precept concept percept workshop like 4 years ago.
What was the
The
name of the
It
piece?
was the clown, the flute. It was a flute piece. Um,
Oh, yes. I think
eh,
Hannah played it.
yes, yeah,
Yes.
yeah, she did. Um,
Right.
and yeah, that's also this very consistent through line, with theatricality, and what I've kind of realized with that is, there's two things that I've actually gained that I'm really zooming into. And one is this question of narrative. Um, in that I realized, I've always really liked how much like movies have had an impact on me. I really like film. It like probably oftentimes inspires me more than art, I think, especially when I like was
More
starting,
than
or sorry,
art?
more than music, excuse me. Um,
What? Film is
it's
art.
yeah, sorry. Yeah. It's a fun fun
Some of
slip.
it.
um, uh, it's yeah, it's always been really important to me. I think
Yeah.
is film, and I think what I got from that was narrative, actually, and I think that's what kind of drove me to this type of music. But it's also manifested itself in actually some of my notated music. My like one of my solo piece for this year for Urban is extremely narrative driven, and the thing that is also related to is this question of horror. Talking about movies, I love horror movies. I've always actually really loved horror movies, for a lot of reasons. Um, and I actually only kind of realized recently, I remember it was like 2 years ago, my friend, and my really close collaborator, Matt Levesque, was like, wow, you write scary music. um, you either, and I
Who
was like, oh,
hasn't
that's it.
heard that writing
Yeah.
composition today?
but but I think he really meant it in like it's like really horrifying
Hmm.
to like listen to. And I think it like, I've heard like, you write scary music, like some of my friends who aren't musicians say that. But I think this was coming from like a different place, and someone who's like really in it.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm, mhm,
um,
mhm.
and
This is
because
also a
that's a
composer that said that.
yes, yes,
Ah,
yeah. And I actually realized that it was only like recently again, it's good that I actually got some sort of introspection out of doctoral lapse in addition to the self-loathing. Um, uh, is that I actually have been writing horror music for quite some time. And I mean that in that I've been writing pieces where there's actually a horror related narrative.
hmm.
Um, there's,
Already in the process of composing.
yeah, I mean, I can think of like back, one of my earlier pieces was this, actually. It was like very clearly like a horror story. It was a piece
Mhm.
for, for, was it baritone, percussion, piano, and cello. I don't really like it anymore, but it's important looking back on, because I was writing this, I was writing something that I wanted to be scary. And I've written other pieces that deal with horror stories. I wrote this piano duo with the spoken text. I wrote this other piece for soprano electronics, lighting, and video called Television Dream Star, which I think is the piece of mine that I think most in depth explores that. That's for soprano Abigail Whitman. Um, and that is very clearly a horror story. And now my piece for Urban for cello and fixed electronics is also a horror story, but this is like a very different one, and it's told in a more abstract way. Um, but this is something that is growing. I'm not growing increasingly important, but I'm realizing that I'm doing it.
Mhm.
And so I guess I'm starting to look sort of to horror actually through the lens of and I guess he's influential in other aspects also, but of Mark Fisher, of thinking about hauntology, of the past haunting the present, and the way that Fisher talks about that in the form of maybe other things in a lot of like
Hauntology.
hauntology.
Haunted
Yes,
ology.
yes, yes. um, you know, of like these lost promises of the future, embedded in like sort of the cultural materials of the past. Um, and so relating that to horror, I've actually and now relating it back to the thing I was talking about the internet. Oftentimes, I realize also my horror stories are related to technology. And so in the case of the piano duo, it was a haunted radio play. In the case of Television Dream Star, it's a haunted TV. Now in the case of Urban's piece, it's actually a haunted ground hum of like a ground hum, like an aux in like an auxiliary chord, like quarter-inch hum. The hum sound when you touch your
Oh.
finger to like a quarter-inch cable. Uh, that's the material for the entire piece. Actually, it's really just focusing on that. Um, and so working with these like very simple digital materials, it's and like I almost feel like you have so much horror within all of them, right? I mean, the television as like a force of cultural control, of all these promises and expectations of XYZ as a child, um, as this nostalgic thing that also wasted your life, sitting in front of, as this this like kind of horrifying thing that like kind of also represents like kind of suburban life and all these expectations of how you know life is supposed to move under capitalism. I mean, I'm not the first person to make a scary piece about a TV, totally. um, but there's so much material in there. um, and so I find it's kind of this beautiful thing of I realized I was actually doing this thing the whole time, and now, or I was doing this thing the whole time, and now I've sort of realized that I'm doing it. So now that I'm conscious of it, I guess we'll see what happens next.
Yeah.
um, but that is also an increasingly interesting part of my practice. And the last thing I'll say is going back to this question of theatricality is like also, and I think this is related to the idea of, me liking film so much. You know, I am interested in a lot of different things as an artist, right? Um, I I like to dive deep, increasingly so, but I also, and this has always been true, I've always liked to try a lot of different things. And I think there's a lot of beauty about working in this type of work that you have to be engaged with oftentimes text. You have to be thinking about narrative very critically. You have to think about dramaturgy. Oftentimes, if you're using, video and lighting, you have to think about all those things. So for me to engage in those things is to just like put it very simply, is fun.
Mm.
And I want making music still to remain fun. And so there's a big element of that in this type of music. And it's a big reason why I still do it, is because it engages this diverse sort of artistic skill portfolio that for me is fun and engaging.
And what's with all this, if you could do anything, uh, what would be the dream composition?
Yeah, totally. It's so interesting you asked that, because like I've been asking myself that a lot, and I feel very. I'm gonna give it like I'll answer it. I'm gonna say it's hard to answer, and then I will answer it. But it's hard to answer. It's hard to answer because I find myself actually increasingly pragmatic about my compositions, and I dream a lot less than I used to. And I remember I had a lesson once with Steve Lehman, um, who studied with Braxton, and talked about how Braxton did a really amazing job of balancing both. And so I want to be able to be like Anthony Braxton, and be able to balance both my big dreams and my practical realities. But also, I think it's when it comes to theatrical work, I really think in the United States, um, I'm not unique to the United States, but at least in my experience in the United States, this work doesn't get done that much, and there's not as much funding to do this type of work. A lot of this type of work I find is done in Europe significantly more, and that's just a result of there being more resources, and more support. Um, so the way that I've actually just been mentally approaching it is like a very DIY ethos. This one piece that was my biggest one with Television Dreamstar was done in a way that could be done basically anywhere. All the lighting was done on a TV that my friend gave me for free. On And the set design was just my bedroom. Things that were in my house in my bedroom and that I found on Facebook Marketplace. And it could be very modular. It could be adapted to multiple different spaces. There were some ideal things I wanted, but it was it's very DIY in that sense. Um, Do it yourself, not relying on anything. And there's something kind of beautiful about that, is that like, the
Yeah.
way I call that piece, it's like DIY Alexander Schubert. Right? It's lo-fi. It's not with all of the, and he's interesting. In other ways, I don't want to get too into that, but that could be a whole nother conversation. Is it creates something else, by that type of ethos. And so I guess there's like a cultural context and an economic context, which one I think has created different work for me, and two has made it hard for me to like actually envision what the ideal thing would be. But now going back to actually answering the question,
Mhm.
um, the thing I really want to do more and more is I actually want to work with actors. Um, I guess this isn't like some sort of grand scheme, but this is like maybe the next small, very tangible step. Is I'm very excited about working with actors. Um, and that I think with Television Dreamstar, I found myself more in like a I was both a composer, but I think I also found myself in a bit of like a director's role with
Mhm.
that one. I mean, you can talk to Abigail, I'm sure, to get their full perspective on it. But in addition to the score being made, the score often involved a lot of it was text boxes and just with text instructions. And a lot of it was not very specific. The score was designed in a way where you cannot just look at it and just get there.
Mhm.
Um, because I'm not interested in that for this type of music. Um, Theater is oftentimes really great because of, it's not oftentimes really great. It is really great because, you have this whole process of diving into this thing, right? Shakespeare's not all there on the page. You have to bring it to life. There's this thing, and there's a, interpretive, you know, dialogue between the actors and the director there. And that's a beautiful thing, right? And that's something that we as musicians are, especially people doing, contemporary music, we don't do that. And so with this piece, because this is somebody I work very closely to, this is my partner. Someone we have the time to be in our apartments and practice this, right?
Mhm.
Um, I built this into this piece because I wanted it to happen. I didn't want to just give it off and just have the score be read. So what I'm interested in next, and I mean, there's like a precedent of this. I feel like like Kaggle actually did this sometimes. I don't know what piece, but I remember there was a piece of his that was like had like similar text instructions. So it's not like something brand new at all. But what I want to do is I want to do that with actors now. Is
Mhm.
can I kind of actually even like take this directorial role a little bit further? Um,
Mhm.
and work and be able to communicate my ideas to somebody who's not a musician and be able to have this sort of interpretive dialogue with somebody who is not a musician. Working with a singer is really awesome, especially someone trained in opera, is because they are an actor as well, and that was really great. And I feel like that's actually the first time I realized that I might be interested in opera because I didn't think I would ever be interested in, but now I think I am. Um, and so yeah, the next step is going to actors. So it's I guess that's not some sort of grand vision, but that feels like a very next tangible step for
Mhm.
me in this type of work.
Um, Out of curiosity, do you look at the works at this stage? I will say, who knows how you will go at this in later stages of this work. At this stage, do you look at any of existing compositions that do this uh, combination of disciplines with actors and yeah, with actors?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So I do like. I mean, I think a lot about like the what I guess Jenny Walsh has now called or made it called the new discipline. Um, this whole movement of um, of sort of music theater, and a lot of that, um, I find not all of it, I think still works within a lot of the working methods of contemporary music. Um, Clearly not all of it. I think maybe my I need you know to expand my palette of what I know. But I think about like some of her music, of like Francois Sarhan, of
Mhm.
Alexander Schubert, um, um, Stephen Takasugi. Um, it really oftentimes works within the working methods of contemporary music. And I'm growing increasingly interested about, that's my background. It'll always be related to that to some way, but just getting a
Mhm.
little bit closer to the working methods of actual theater. And there's this group that I am increasingly interested in, but I don't know a ton about still. I think they're based in New York. Object collection, um, that I think has found this kind of ideal middle ground where I think they're kind of just a theater company of musicians. Um, but they also have like this really strong background in theater, which I don't have, and I'm actually really hoping to gain. So I think actually what I'm looking towards more is, and this is what I've been telling myself for the past, probably year and a half, and I just
Mhm.
haven't gotten my ass into shape, is I need to look at theater more, actually. I'm more interested in in looking there so that I can understand more about those working methods, because
Mhm.
I don't want to get too trapped in the working methods of music, because I find that that's kind of the zeitgeist of how things are going, at least in that sort of new discipline way of thinking now. At least that's my overview of like
Mhm.
I'm certainly oversimplifying the entire movement.
I must admit,
Um,
I did think of Camille Saint-Saëns' Carnival des Animaux
okay.
because
Very
because
different.
I heard the version where an actor, uh,
Hmm.
Mrs. Argerich's daughter,
Hmm.
while Argerich was playing the piano and the daughter was reading, and it was not just reading; it was really enacting that
Totally.
text. Um, So I thought, you know, it's always curious to think about where the ideas that we come across today in is quite fresh, still fresh,
Yeah,
fresh
totally.
composers.
Totally.
How some things already existed.
Hmm.
I don't know how it was in that time. That right, it was not really premiered in the course of his lifetime, but but
Hmm.
just more like fun thought.
Yeah. Well,
How
that's
it's already happened.
I like that example though, because I also that feels like the lineage of of this, like combining these theatrical things with the working methods of
Yeah,
contemporary music. I mean, that's proof that
exactly,
there's a lineage, right? And that actually what's
exactly. Yeah,
happening these days,
exactly.
I actually in a lot of ways is probably not that different from that. Um, and but yeah, so it's yeah, what the thing that I guess I was critiquing, and I'm not really critiquing it. It's just not what I'm always super interested in doing. It feels like a limitation for me. That's been going on for a long time. So I like that that was your example.
Great. Um, all right. May I, before we go to the conclusion, also
Hmm.
just ask you, uh, before you started composing, are you coming from an instrumental practice? And quickly, just how did you get to composition in the first
Hmm.
place?
Yeah. So my background is as a jazz saxophonist. I had no intention of doing any music beyond just for fun. I was never like that good. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I love jazz forever, always and forever. Um, and then I think one thing led to another. In college, I took a composition class, kind of accidentally. I wanted to take an electronic music class. I ran into the composition professor. She convinced me to take a composition class, and one thing led to another, and here we are. It
Right.
just that working method just really resonated with me. The working method of creating something, sculpting it over time, of diving into it, um, of thinking about, form, all these questions. I mean, it was just so awesome and exciting. And just years, things happened bit by bit. I actually didn't even intend to study music in college. I was studying environmental policy, and then I just kind of realized that I just really cared about this like more than anything ever in the entire world. And I just started doing it more and more, and it became more and more part of my life. The more it was a very gradual process. I actually oftentimes like look around me. I'm like, well, what the hell happened? How did we get here? You know, a very David Byrne, uh, uh, Talking Heads, once in a lifetime moment. Uh, and so, um, yeah, it was that's how it happened. But I will say, actually, going back to the jazz saxophone, is that actually I think really still influences the way that I think about notation and performance quite a bit. Um, is that I still, I come from that sort of, I mean, improvised background, but also, a lead sheet is a very clear form of composition, and there's, a very the way solos are taken and head at the beginning and end is a very clear type of form. It's this really, unique form of composition where not everything is written down, and I think that to me is all, and the performers have to give something that is, I think, always been really important and influential to me, and still oftentimes the music I write will always have that, right? I don't want to write everything down, not because I'm lazy or not because I'm trying to emancipate the performer, but because I find that more interesting things can happen that way, and that I can get to what I want better. Fernie Howe is really interesting because it sounds the way it sounds because it's notated the way it's notated. That's amazing. I find his music actually extremely inspiring and really important to me. But you cannot get a saxophonist to sound like you know like Pharoah Sanders or Coltrane or Eric Dolphy or Ornette Coleman, um, uh, if or bass clarinetist, to sound like Eric Dolphy. Sorry, or I guess saxophonist also, but I feel like someone was going
Flautist
to roast
also.
potentially flat. Yes, also. um, uh, you can to by writing it all down, and so I often think about notation in like this very strategic way of withholding information when I feel that that will serve the music better. And I feel like jazz is a perfect example of that, right? You're withholding information sometimes in, a lead sheet because that's going to make the music better. Um, if you wrote it all down, it's going to be stupid. to put it to put it very bluntly. I use that word in way too much
Okay.
but I think it's funny, so I'll keep doing it. So I bring this up because that background, it may not feel like it's related to what I'm doing, even though I do have actually a very strong improvised music practice, which I think does relate back to that, on electronics.
You still
Um,
practice improvisation?
Yes, a lot. That's actually probably what I do the most in Los Angeles, actually. It's probably people maybe know me more as an improviser than as a composer. I think actually a lot of people don't know that I write concert music, which is kind of funny because I think that's like the center of my practice. But I do have like a very strong improvised electronics practice.
Electronics
That's
and saxophone or only electronics?
just mostly, I'll bring out the saxophone like once or twice a year.
Mm.
Um,
For
but
the
it's
star
it's
concert.
yeah, but it's primarily electronics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's all to say that this background in jazz saxophone has actually, I think, really influenced the way that I think about music, even though it's not obvious.
Certainly.
Hmm.
Um, well, just to the point of withholding information and not writing everything down,
Hmm.
uh, I would say I also noticed this that it's always uh, that always the older periods of classical music are
Hmm.
considered to be all written down, but
They're not,
they're not. They're also
and it's
not, right?
awesome.
And it, yeah, exactly.
I think about this all the time, right? Is
Yeah.
that like, I mean, there's so much, in whatever, in Bach,
Yeah.
in
That is
in
not
Mozart
written.
as well, that's not written down, that, I mean, people have just, come and they've done beautiful things with it,
Yeah.
right? And it's so interesting that contemporary music has like gone to this very deterministic scientific approach in inherently. I mean, obviously not all of it, but like,
Yeah.
this sort of modernist approach to it thinks about it. But that's, again, like you're exactly like you're saying, like classical music did not come from that.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and that's, so there's a precedent,
Not to
right?
mention
There's
the improvisations and
totally, yeah.
cadences. Yeah. Yeah.
Baroque music, I mean, all that stuff, it's amazing.
Yeah.
So it's this scientific determinism, actually, it's a very recent thing. And I think it's actually kind of important to um,
Yeah.
not just
For sure.
not just buy into it,
Mhm.
because um, there's very strong implications about what that means. It's related to the world that we live in. We live in a positivist world where things,
Mhm.
are more true if can be measured, if they can be determined, etc.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and and I'm usually not interested in reinforcing that. Sometimes
Mhm.
it's what the piece needs and what
Mhm.
feels very, very necessary.
Yeah.
But very often for me, that is not what I'm interested in doing. So yes,
And if
I
I recall
totally.
correct, even the beginning of music literacy with Newman, it was
Mhm.
all approximated. If I remember correct right now.
I
Yeah.
I'm not totally
Yeah.
I'm not totally sure.
Anyway,
Mhm.
it's great to just think of that also, as you mentioned, in terms of legacy, where does
Mhm.
a certain idea come from. At this point, let's go to the conclusion. As each of my guests, I would also ask you for two brief messages. One for anyone that is aspiring to begin with composition. Um, Again, despite you also being a composer in development, still a message for anyone of those, and the second message for anyone that will go and listen to your music.
Sure. So the first one, I think, is that I really believe that I've been thinking about this lately, of a music of abundance. Um, is that often we is really important to believe in a music of abundance. That we're often told that music talent is something that is scarce, that only few can access, both for obviously socioeconomic reasons, but also it's like this, like, god-given talent that only people, you have to have the talent, then you have to practice, blah blah blah, and only then can you access the beautiful music, right? That's bullshit. All right. And I really, really believe that that is unhelpful, um, because a music of abundance does not believe in that sort of mentality of scarcity of beautiful music, but that anybody can engage in sound in a meaningful and personal way. And that is something that everybody can do. Um, and if you can do that with whatever means you have, um, whatever that means, then you're composing, right? And so what's really important is to just work with the means that you have, whatever that is, and to make music with that. You can engage in sound if you crinkle a plastic bag here. The screen's blurring it out, but you get the idea, right? Um, if whatever it is, I could make it. Probably, maybe I can make the best piece I've ever made with this plastic bag, and I just don't really know it yet. And what I really is important is, like, I don't think that's any different from anything that I've ever done. Is that I don't consider myself like an amazing musician with an amazing ear. Um, I consider myself always, from the day I started to now, is making music within my means and just doing whatever I can with whatever the situation that I have is now. And I think what's beautiful about that is that there's no, that is something that is infinite, that is something that is abundant, that is something that no one can take away from anybody, that is something that is not just limited to a certain few um, group of people. And so that's sort of my ethos of creation, that truly anybody can participate in, no matter really what your background is. Um, and so that's my answer to the first question. And then the answer to the second question of listening to my music is to take the things that we've talked about and today, and then take them to heart, use them to guide your ear, but also to forget about them the second that you listen and to draw your own conclusions. Because at the end of the day, I'm also it's important to have. I like having some sort of framing for listening, but I'm also very excited to hear what what a listener would have to say um, without that framing. Because without, that's how I got the comment of the realization that I write horror music oftentimes. And not that I write it, but that I wanted to, right? Because somebody was listening to my music with their own subjectivities and came to their own conclusions, right? I don't want to take that, the act of interpretation away. So I think, enjoy listening. That's it.
Jack Herscowitz, thank you very much.
Thank you, Neža. It's great to talk.